let's talk about research articles. So, to someone who's new to exercise science, research articles are often one of the most confusing and mystifying things about the field. So, let's go ahead and start to demystify these a little bit. First off, why we need to understand them is maybe our most important question. So it's pretty easy to picture how someone like this guy right here, someone who lives in the lab, a lab rat, dedicated to the nitty gritty details of exercise science, might want to understand a research article. They're filled with very detailed experiences, very detailed, data driven facts. But for many of us, they at least initially go over our head, or they're just so in the weeds that we don't understand their application to our field. So let's describe this based off one of my key philosophies as an exercise scientist. If you want to be good at what you do, you need to live at the intersection of experience and data and research. So, if you want to really excel in your field, whether it's coaching, personal training, being a physical therapist, being a scientist like this guy, what you need to do is you need to understand the facts around the field. You need to understand and know and have the data and the knowledge at your fingertips, so that you can understand the field and the details that surround you. Now, why you also need experience is you need to be able to have the experience to understand how these apply in real life. So the way that this data and science works is we do a research project. So let's take one of my students. One of my students did a research project with roughly 40 participants. So we have 40 people, and we look at these 40 people and we say, all right, we're going to have you do this and see how it affects this. So if we go and we see across these 40 people, there's a trend that X affects Y, then that's great data. That's great knowledge to have, because we can predict, at least in the average person, that this phenomenon is going to happen. Now, what experience allows you to do is to parse through these details and understand that within these 40 people, you have someone who doesn't respond at all. Like whatever you said happened in the research article doesn't happen for them. Each person's unique. And then you also have someone on the other end who is a huge responder. Whatever you say is like as much a fact for that person as can be. They go crazy when you do X. Whereas most people, X equals Y, they equal Y times 100. So what we need to be able to do is kind of reach into this research, take the facts, have those at your fingertip, at least know how to access them, how to kind of get the basics out of the research, and then we can apply it using our experience, in that real world knowledge that it takes to really excel. But you need both. You can't go completely off experience. So one of the classics is, at least in the field of exercise science, is you have this amazing, stunning athlete. They've excelled on the world stage. They've been the best of the best. No one can beat them. They get to the end of their athletics career, and what's the natural progression? Well, they go become a coach. So then they have this whole team of people in front of them. And what sort of training do you think they do? Well, they do exactly what they did, because that's what made them great, right? Well, what research allows us to do is understand that they are somewhere along this continuum of the 40 participants in the study. Maybe they're that 40th person who really crazy responds, but everyone else is way back here. So what research allows us to do in the other direction is say, okay, let's look at what works for the average person and start honing in to a group. So what we often see with these coaches is they aren't able to make that connection where they say, this is what worked for me, this was my experience, but they can never find that intersection of data or knowledge. They can't gather the data. They can't run these like mini unofficial research studies within their teams, within their clients, within whatever it is that you want to do. They can't make those connections in a meaningful sense. So we need research. So let's jump in here. You may be at varying levels of understanding research. I don't know how much you as an individual have approached this, so we're going to kind of go to the basics here. So here is our research pages. So we need to understand where to go. So if you're a Montreat College student, here's the Montreat College page. So we can go down, and at the bottom of any section, no matter which page on the website you're on, there is this library button at the bottom. So go ahead and click that, and you'll go to the library resources. So this is where we start. We have a great library staff here at Montreat, so you can use this to really dive in. We have lots of resources. So first thing you could do is you could say, I want to search whatever it may be. You put it in. Let's say we're doing muscle hypertrophy. We want to know how to make our muscles grow. So we do search, and we're going to come back with a huge amount of results, which makes sense. We have a very generic term here. So what we could start to do is we could start to sort of narrow it down. We could go to the elderly. We want to know how to maintain muscle in an aging person. So we can keep going. We could say we're particularly worried about someone who has cancer cachexia, which is muscle loss due to cancer. And we're going to narrow it down. And then maybe we find what we were looking for here. So we have resistance training, muscular strength, hypertrophy, and elderly cancer patients. Great. That's what we're looking for. And we can go from there. Now, what we can also do is we can sort of narrow it down on the sides here. Maybe we want something that was published within the last 3 years. We want to make sure the full text is online so we can actually access it. And we can keep going from there and narrowing. Now that's great and all, but you're only at Montreat for so long before this resource no longer is at your fingertips. So most people in the real world need something outside of just their college. So I'll show you that in a minute. But before we move on, one other tool is, let's say you found something that you wanted to look at or you wanted to read, but there was not a free full text, meaning you couldn't actually access the research article. You could just get a little snippet of it, but you wanted the whole thing. We got this cool thing called an interlibrary loan request. You may have heard of it already. You can go here, put in your email, first name, phone number, all this information, and then say you're looking for a journal article. You go to next, you put in the journal article's information, and then that sends it to our library team, who then goes and finds you a copy of what you want to read. This is a superpower. They're really good at what they do. They'll get it to you quickly, and usually can find what you're looking for. Now, like I said, you won't be at Montreat forever. And I kind of have a personal bias because this is what I tend to use, is what's called PubMed. It's a publicly available medical journal database put out by the National Library of Medicine and the NIH. So again, let's go back to muscle hypertrophy. So we have muscle hypertrophy. Again, we have a similar concept here. We can do free full text. We can narrow down the years. So first publication is 1897, but we really only want something in the last 15 years, we'll say. You can also narrow down by the type of article. We'll talk about types of article here in a bit. But we can go through and start to find what we're looking for. So let's say in this case, we'll just take our first suggestion here. Molecular mechanisms of skeletal muscle hypertrophy. You can click on that. Get the abstract. This abstract is a quick little snippet of what the article is about. So we're going to talk about some different pathways like PGC1 alpha, satellite cell proliferation, mTORC, things of that nature. So then we can go to read it, hit free full text, and sure enough, it pops up with the whole article. Now, free full text might not always be there even when they have a free full text. So if we go back to this page here that we were at a second ago, you can see there's another link through, it looks like probably the journal that actually published this article. And again, we get that free full text. If you cannot get a free full text off of this, that's where you go to that interlibrary loan and they'll track it down for you. So our next thing is about different types of articles here. So our first kind and our most common kind is just that standard research article. I did a study, I wrote about my study, and then I published my study. Often these are going to be called randomized controlled trials, so we can narrow it down in that way. This is your standard study type, one study, just what one group of researchers have done. So let's look at this first article. This is great. Resistance training volume enhances muscle hypertrophy but not strength in trained men. So what it's saying here, we can guess, is that if you add volume, you'll put on muscle, but not necessarily strength in trained men. And we can kind of dive into why that is and look at the methodology, but it's an interesting concept. So we look at the free full text. Now, what you may have noticed before is these articles are split up into multiple sections. It's important to understand the purpose of each of these sections. So first off, we have our abstract. Again, just a snippet, gives you the bare basics that you need to kind of get an idea what will be in the bigger article. From there, you might see a certain type or certain aspect of this study would be interesting. So the first one that's often going to show up, and whether it's labeled or not, is going to be the introduction, or background would be another term. So what we have is nothing here is new for this first section. It gives you all the background information you need to understand the study. It says, okay, we've looked through previous research. We know here's what's happening, here's what we don't know, here's what we plan to answer in this study. So this can be helpful sometimes to get you caught up on things you may or may not know. Our next one is the methods. Now the methods, they don't give you any data about what happened. They don't give you any history about what studies have been done before. This is simply just what they did in the study. So what tools did they use? What protocol did they... So in the case of this study, we might be curious what type of workout or what kind of volume they did. So we can look and we can see there was a low volume group of 1 set. There was a moderate volume group of 3 sets. And there was a high volume group of 5 sets. And that's per training session. And we can look through and probably get some more information. Here's the workout that they did. They did bench press, military press, lateral pull downs, back squats, leg press, leg extension, cable row. Okay, so we go down. They check their diet. Here's how they check their diet. Here's what they measured. They measured their body composition. They measured their muscle thickness. So if you were curious how to measure muscle thickness, then this is where you might read to kind of get an idea of how to measure muscle thickness. Or if you have multiple techniques, like maybe they put a tape measure around the muscle. Or in this case, it looks, just from a quick glance, it looks like they're doing ultrasound. So just like they do an ultrasound on looking for a baby, you can do an ultrasound looking at veins or arteries or muscles. In this case, the ultrasound goes, takes an image of that muscle and measures it in a very technical fashion. We did 1 rep maxes, explains how to do that. They did muscle endurance, explains how they did that, and then how they did the stats. So again, no data yet, but now we understand how they did the study. So that's the method section. Our next one up is results. They give no opinions about what happened in the study or why things happened in the study. Instead, in results, all they give is data. So no opinions, just pure data. So first off, they're explaining who actually got into the groups. Looks like they had a few people quit the study before it was over for personal reasons. They didn't follow the rules. They were injured, unrelated to the training or related to the training. So again, you see these different reasons it's explaining, probably not that important. Okay, we go on, we get the data about the 1 rep, their squat 1 rep max. So we see here's the data, here's the stats that was run on that data. We move on, again, data. And then we get to the discussion. Now, before we gave just purely data in the results, now the discussion is giving the opinions about why that data happened. So we can go through and we can see their explanation about why volume was associated with, what was it? Muscle hypertrophy, so the actual size of the muscle, but it didn't correlate to strength. So they explain why. So this might be a useful section a lot of times to get some of the main ideas from a study and giving what's new. Once we get through this, and sometimes they'll be really short, sometimes they'll be longer like this one, we get to conclusions. And conclusions is the quick conclusion, another final snippet here just saying, all right, here's what happened, here's why we think it happened, and we put that into only a few sentences. Another quick way to kind of glance through and understand what happened. So as you can see, each of these sections serves a very particular purpose. So as a reader, you might go check one out versus another one out for different purposes, or you might read the whole article. To be completely honest with you, very rarely am I going to read the whole article. I just don't have the time to do that. If I'm trying to get ideas, usually I'm trying to dive into a certain section, digging for the particular things that I want to see. If it's a really interesting study, maybe I look at the whole thing, but generally I'm trying to get the main ideas quickly and I glance through or go specifically to what I want to see. Now, the cool thing is you might not always have time to read hundreds of studies to get the main idea of a concept. So if you're worried about muscle hypertrophy, you're trying to figure out about how it happens, but you don't have time to read like 100 articles, each giving just a little bit more or a little bit more or a little bit more information, but instead you want just almost like a textbook chapter on it. This is where we get into reviews. So there's different kinds of reviews. There's review, systematic review, a review often is going to be something where it's kind of narrative. They're talking through a concept almost, where systematic review is where they follow a system. So before they start writing this review, they say, here's how I'm going to go about it. Here's where I'm going to get data from this to kind of explain. It's minute detail. As a general statement, I would say probably look at both if you're just trying to get a quick grasp on something. So again, we can see we have molecular mechanisms of skeletal muscle hypertrophy. So if you want to just take a dive into molecular mechanisms, but you don't want to read a whole study about mTORC, and you don't want to read a whole study about PGC1 alpha or satellite cells or 10 articles about each of these, but you want to get the main ideas, that's where this review comes into place. So you'll see there aren't the typical patterns. There's not the methods, results, discussion, the same. Often what you're going to see instead is you're going to see an introduction, and then you're going to go into these subheadings about certain topics. So if we are worried about, you can see all these different things, but whatever it is, you can go read the section you're interested in, or you can read the whole thing. Now, like I said, this is a little bit like reading the chapter of a textbook. What I mean by that is if you're new to a topic, or you want to get like the overarching idea, the big ideas, and you don't want to get into the nitty gritty details right away, these review articles are the way to go. Super helpful. Give you a lot of information quickly. And again, it's been written by researchers. It's been written by experts. So the facts you read are going to be accurate, unlike some things on the internet, as you know. So there's one other type of review I want to show you. I classify it as a review. You can kind of classify it as a study as well. But it's something called a meta-analysis. Now, what a meta-analysis does is it uses statistics to compile a lot of studies. So let's say we have 20 studies, and they were all looking at slightly different things. But what we see as a thread between them is they're all seeing how X affects Y. So what we do is then we take all those 20 studies, we focus on just the X versus Y part. You compile all that data into one statistical thing, and then you run that stats together. So let's say, for example, each of these 20 studies has 10 participants. So we see for these 10 people, this is what happens. Now, some of those studies might find that it happens. Other studies might find it doesn't happen, right? So how do you decide who's right? The studies that and 10 people say yes, and 10 people on another study say no. Well, you take 20 studies times 10 people, and now you have 200 people. So what we can do is then run stats on that. And what we end up finding is X does affect Y in a sample of 200 people rather than just 10. So it's kind of a useful thing to say, all right, when we have a lot of studies on a concept, where we can sort of combine them together to see what does or doesn't work. So it's a little bit like a review, but you start to add in some stats on top of the review. So again, you'll see where it's describing things. In this case, meta-analyses do have methods explaining how they ran those stats, how they picked out which studies belonged in this study, in the meta-analysis. Because as you can imagine, when you take 20 studies that are looking at slightly different things, the cutoffs for whether they're talking about what you're talking about or not can sometimes be a fine line, but we describe that in the methods. Then we get to the results. We see when we combine all these studies, like you can see here, 50 something studies have been combined. And then we can see what the end result is. So if we go through, Again, you'll see graphs and you'll see numbers. But what you'll also see is a results and a conclusion section, just like a normal research article would have. See, discussion starts here. So the discussion is then going to discuss all these different factors that come into play. So, pretty cool thing. Research is something that, like I said before, everyone should kind of get a grasp of. It's something you got to practice. You got to get your reps in. Otherwise, you aren't going to really make it that far. You aren't going to have all this data at your fingertips. So, as you go through classes, as you get more and more mature within the field of exercise science, be intentional about practicing. Put in the little work to understand what is in each section of an article, what different articles look like, and start to piece together these big terms that you may or may not be familiar with. And before you know it, it's going to be second nature. This was overwhelming to me. Now I've written articles that you can find on PubMed. I can grasp concepts even if it's slightly outside of my field or my niche, and it's a really cool thing. So one last piece here. Well, maybe that is my last piece. But yeah, this is research articles. If you have any questions, reach out to your instructor. They can help you more. I'm going to go ahead and pause this for a second, and I might come back in a minute if I remember what I was supposed to say. Okay, I remembered what I wanted to say. Basically, I just wanted to assure you that this is not just me who thinks this. This is an actual market trend. This is things that people who are hiring and experts in their fields all throughout exercise science are looking for people to be able to do. So, last summer, I was very intentional about looking and talking to different contacts, different experts in different fields. So I talked to one of the top, someone who works for one of the top physical therapy schools in the country. I talked to a former Olympic volleyball coach. I talked to researchers, but they're biased. And I've talked to personal trainers who are really excelling. And I said, what do you want to see students be able to do? And they all came back with this idea of data. Everyone's got these ideas, these experiences that they believe in. That's not unique in an applicant. That's not unique in someone they're looking to hire. What's unique is when someone can truly parse through data and understand it. So they've said someone who can run data or even code or at least run statistics and understand statistics is important. But what's even more important is just being able to actually get this data. It's at their fingertips. Can people grasp it? And that's a personal decision for you, whether you're going to go through the effort to make research easy, or are you going to miss this opportunity? Not trying to push you one way. It's your decision, your career. But I just want to give background that while this is a strong opinion of mine, it is shared across exercise science. And I'd really encourage you to take a grasp at it. So take a swing in this class. Other classes, keep practicing. You'll get there. Have a good day.